Okay, so I'm going to talk about what I call the swamp, which is basically in chapter 1 I talked about various value streams, the idea value stream, which is the stream that gets the project started, which has attracts value from sounding good, basically from being an attractive idea. I talked about the difficulty because what you need to do is you need to build a real value stream, which actually generates real value from customers. Um, and in between those two, I talked about it being a wilderness, and this being the wilderness that you mostly inhabit. So I'm just going to lower this camera slightly. This being a wilderness that you mostly inhabit when you're managing projects, and I'm going to be more specific about what kind of wilderness that is between those two value streams now, and kind of use another metaphor, another way of seeing this, as a swamp. And what do I mean by it being a swamp? I don't mean that negatively. I don't mean that by being a kind of bad place that nobody would want to go. In fact, quite the opposite. What I mean is that there are lots and lots of things going on there. So if you think about, if you were going to build something in a real swamp, what sorts of things might you want to know about? Well, you might want to know if there are any existing structures there. Like, so are there any things that have already been built there, or were there things built there that failed? You might want to think about natural resources. Like, so are there things around in this swamp that are just naturally available that could be useful? So if it was a real swamp, that could be timber, or it could be water, or it could be oil that was in the ground or something. So what is around, like in the natural resources? What is scarce? So are there things that kind of it's difficult to get to this swamp? Is it difficult to get power there? Is it difficult to get roads to get access to it? So, kind of like what sorts of things are kind of difficult to get access to? Those are kind of natural resources. What about people? Who lives there? Who lives in this complex environment? Who is already inhabiting it? And also who might live there, who might want to come and live there if you build something in this complex environment, and who owns it. So that might be, in fact, probably very likely will be a different bunch of people from the people who live there and the people who want to live there. There are people who own it. And property developers, who is paying you to do work in this area? Is it the owners? Is it somebody other than the owners? Is it the people who live there? Is it people who want to live there? There are all sorts of people around this swamp, maybe, that have some kind of interest in it. And beyond all of those kind of people who have either direct or indirect ownership, there are a bunch of other people. There are governors and regulators. So everywhere we are in the world, there is some kind of government, there's some kind of regulation. And this swamp is probably covered by some of that regulation. What is that regulation? Who are the people who have jurisdiction over this piece of complicated space? And beyond even that, so beyond the people who live there, the people who might want to live there, the people who own it, the people who want to do something, want to fund something to happen in that area, and all of the people who regulate it, there are other people. So I've written this down as like environmental campaigners. So people who care about the rainforest don't necessarily own the rainforest. They don't live in the rainforest. They don't want to live in the rainforest. And they don't have jurisdiction over the rainforest, if that's a kind of swamp. But they still care about it. They still care about what goes on there. And they have kind of campaigning and political views about what happens. And this might be the same for the project that you're working on. So beyond all of those other people, now you're getting the idea here that this is a complex environment, and this is also a metaphor. So I'll just revisit all of these in a minute and talk about how they directly apply to software. So we talked about regulators, and when we talked about environmental campaigners. And beyond that, there's somebody else I've just written: law, religion, superstition. So there might be laws of the land, which are not directly applicable to this space. They're not intended for this space, but they still apply in this space. There might be some kind of religion. So there may be kind of ways of doing things, beliefs that people have who inhabit this space, or beliefs that people have about this space that are relevant and important. And there may be superstitions. There may be kind of irrational beliefs about what can go on in this space, what can happen in this space, that are still going to be relevant. Now, I've been talking here about this metaphorical swamp, but I'm just going to go back and talk about how these things might apply for a software development project. So, existing structures. So you might be replacing an existing piece of software, or you might be having to interact with existing pieces of software. So it's very good to know what those pieces of software are. Natural resources. So some things inside this organization might be easy. It might be easy to, for example, get access to users. It might be very hard to get access to users. Money might not be an object. I know that sounds crazy, but I've worked for organizations that make a lot of money, and money is not necessarily the problem, and the resource that's in scarce supply. There are other things that are in scarce supply, like, for example, access to users, or possibly time within which a project needs to be developed, or access to, it may be that the people that you need to talk to, who know how this system is going to work, they're very difficult to get hold of. They're a scarce resource because they're so busy, or they're very well paid and their time costs enormous amounts of money, or they're just difficult people to get access to because they don't necessarily want to talk to you, all sorts of reasons like that. So this comes on to the kind of resonance. So there are people who are already working in this complex environment. They're doing things. Are they happy with the way things are working and they don't want the changes that you are bringing? Or are they unhappy with the way things are working and they do want the changes that you are bringing, or some kind of somewhere in between? Potential residents. So there are people who might want to start working in this environment who don't at the moment. What are their hopes and fears and frustrations and enthusiasms? How do they kind of interact with the people who are already there? So kind of like, one of the tricky things very often with projects that kind of are tipped to saving money is that the way that money saving is explained or expressed is in full-time employees. So that kind of, if we have this system, we can get rid of a certain number of full-time employees. There's obviously a lot of sensitivity around that kind of thing. Governors and regulators. What are all the rules and regulations that affect this area of software, etc.? This could really vary depending on what kind of field you're in. But kind of, if you're working in government, there'll be all sorts of rules and regulations particular to that department, but also kind of particular to kind of the way that government has to do things, procurement rules. Rules about access to data, etc. So all sorts of different kind of rules and regulations. And when you're working in this environment, you need to try and find out as much about those things as possible. I'm going to talk about that phrase as much as possible a little bit later on. And environmental campaigners. So I've worked on projects that are extremely sensitive in nature, and there are lots of people outside the organization who have opinions about what goes on inside the organization. To what degree do you have to pay attention to those people? To what degree are those people going to make it difficult for you to do what you're going to do, for reasons, for example, like if they find out about how much this project's going to cost, they're going to question how much it's going to cost, etc. Are there things that you just cannot do? Are there words you cannot use, etc.? So all sorts of things like that around the politics, which is pretty much what it is, around the politics of what this system is going to do. And then law, religion, and superstition. You may find it strange that I'm talking about superstition, but often inside organizations, there are various articles of belief. There are various ideas that, for example, projects never succeed in this organization. That's one kind of law or superstition that I've come across. Another one is a religion that the only way to do projects is to detail them, get them to a sufficient amount of detail that you can estimate them within plus or minus 10%. Nobody was ever able to tell me what that amount of detail would be, but this was a firm kind of religion or superstition inside the organization that had to be something that would be done before you start development on a project. So what I'm talking here is, what I'm trying to make clear is, you are trying to build something inside a complex space. And because you're trying to build something inside a complex space, I'm just going to check if I've got any punters on Zoom. I don't think I do. I'm going to keep talking. Because you're trying to build something inside a complex space, you need to discover things about that complex space. Now, remember a while ago, I just said as much as possible. That's not strictly true, because what you're trading off finding out what you can about the organization and all of these different complexities against actually making progress with the project. So, yes, you want to find out it's not as much as you can. You want to find out stuff about this environment, but you don't want to go on forever. So one of the kind of strategies I'm going to talk about for kind of finding out in this environment is user research, but you don't want to just keep doing user research, that phrase, as much as possible. You want to do user research in conjunction with other things to explore this space. So you're trying to explore this space for a couple of reasons, really. Like, to understand really how things get done around here, because some aspects of this complex space could quite easily kill your project stone dead if you, for example, if you don't manage to get to talk to the people who actually know how the project should work, or actually know how the thing should be delivered. That won't be useful, and you could kill the project stone dead that way. But also, and this is not something that often gets talked about, if you can get a good enough understanding of this complex space, you might discover opportunities. You might discover ways that you can connect what you're doing to some organization-wide initiative. You might find that there are other things going on in the organization that would support you and you could support them. So there may be, inside this complex space, there may be opportunities that you can exploit to kind of actually make your project go faster and better and be more productive and deliver more value. So it's important to start to understand this space. Now, what sorts of strategies are you going to do to explore this space? So I've already talked about user research. And yes, user research is very important. Talking to current residents, so talking to people who are already in this complex space. Talking to potential residents, so talking to people who might use your product and what they want. And also balancing that with talking to senior stakeholders. So a kind of anti-pattern historically with projects is just only being interested in what senior stakeholders say. But if you're really exploring this complex space, you need to understand what all of these potential stakeholders have to say, and also start to kind of create a map, start to kind of understand which people you have talked to, which people maybe you haven't talked to that you should need to talk to, and then which people are kind of beyond that you don't need to talk to because they're not directly in the neighborhood of where you're working with this project. So that's important, the user research. But remember what I said about the kind of like as much as possible. We need to kind of have a good idea about what is actually possible. And part of tempering that is by connecting doing user research with showing working software as soon as possible. So this is kind of where what I'm talking about is cutting across kind of ideas like double diamond development. What I'm talking about here is as soon as possible getting working things or kind of near working things. They're like designs that are clickable, I would say, like they're on the way to working things, and showing those as widely as you can within the organization and getting feedback for them. Now, obviously, if you get feedback for those things, what you're doing is you're further exploring this complex space, but you're also creating a headache for yourself, because then somebody has to kind of then decide what to make of this feedback that's coming back. And I haven't talked very much in this book about various roles in Agile, but like just a little bit now I'll talk about product owner. This is where, if you have a product owner that has good knowledge of the organization, that can be extremely useful. Because if you have a product owner that has good knowledge of the organization, not only will they know some of this stuff about the complex space right off the bat as they start doing the project, but they will also be able to give the team and the project better guidance about what is relevant that needs to be explored and what is irrelevant that doesn't need to be explored. And then also, when feedback comes in after you've produced working software and started to get feedback on it, they will be absolutely vital in being able to tell you what aspects of that feedback is important and what aspects of that feedback is not important. So this is the two main strategies for exploring this complex space are user research and communicating working software, and also possibly making working software available so that people can kind of self-report having used it and give feedback, etc. So those are the two main ways. But then I think there's a third way as well, which is related to senior stakeholders, which is throughout the project, basically understanding what is going on organizationally. And obviously, like if you're working on a project in a kind of relatively self-contained fashion, and you're working either as a third party or you're working, kind of, even if you're in the same organization, you might be in a different part of the organization if you're delivering the software. Then they might not want to tell you all of the things that are going on. They might not want to tell you the good and the bad and the ugly of what's going on in their organization. But some of that stuff might be pertinent to what's happening in your project. And so one thing that I found that is extremely useful is to have some kind of meeting, and a name that I've had for this meeting that I found useful is risks and issues, where you track what you think the perceived risks are to the project. And this is a very good way of calling out, for example, if people who really need to tell you the detail of how this system is going to work are refusing to talk to you, or if there's some fundamental aspect of the technology that you're not managing to deal with, or if you're not getting regulatory, the thing we talked about kind of discovering the regulators, you're not getting cooperation from the regulators, or you need somebody inside their organization to talk to the regulators. So it's good for kind of all of that kind of good business of actually solving the problems of a project. But if you do this regularly, and one of the things I found really useful is if you have some way of visualizing like what the amount of risk is that's on the project. I'll talk about that much later in the book when I talk about kind of practical strategies. But let's say every fortnight you get together with senior stakeholders on the project and you talk about what the risks are, and you run through the top most important risks, and you say, are there any other risks? Now, one of the things that is extremely useful in that kind of situation is to hear about any risks that change or appear or disappear. That kind of aspect of this is extremely important, because I know this sounds really weird, but like by doing that, by telling you about risks that have changed, by telling you about new risks that have appeared and that come and go if you have these meetings frequently, you start to get an idea of the kind of corporate weather inside this organization. If there's any new big thing going on, some new big change that might affect your project, you start to hear about that. And so this is essentially the kind of the third foot of the tripod of the kind of things that you need to be paying attention to in this complex environment. Is you need to be looking at what is going on in the corporate structures, what is changing in the corporate structures that might affect the project. And so this is something that I can't think of anything. I mean, obviously there are a lot of books that are advocating user-centered design and user experience, and that's great, and I have enormous respect for that as a way of moving forward with software development, and I think that's even better. That performs even better if it's connected to actual working software, so that kind of like there's people talk to users, they get an idea for a design, that design is developed, that's moved into working software, and then that's kind of built on with the kind of next bit of functionality. That is a very solid way of de-risking projects. But I don't often see, and I think part of the reason for this is because, how are you going to market this to the people who are actually paying? That one of the things that you need to be doing on a project is exploring the organization and understanding how the organization works and feeding that feedback back into the way that the project happens. And this is tremendously important. I'll give you a couple of examples. One kind of bad and one kind of good. So a project I was working on recently, fairly out of the blue, we were given a short deadline. We were told that we needed to make this project available and working for a particular deadline. Part of the way that was discussed was we were told that we'd always been told that was going to be the deadline, which I don't think was true. And my take on that is really kind of whenever people set you deadlines is to deliver as much as you can for the deadline, because a deadline means that we're going to get access to actual live users, and that's always going to be useful in terms of feedback and information. But it later emerged that this deadline had been mentioned by one of our senior stakeholders across the organization as a promise, and we didn't know about that. And I'm not sure what we could have done to know about this deadline, because I think part of what was going on was that it was deliberately being kept secret from us. But kind of what it made me think was is a risk that I was going to put on future risk registers, is there is a deadline that we don't know about, basically. And that's a valid risk, and that's a useful one that I'm probably going to be talking about in risk meetings from now on, is just saying, I think there might be somewhere in the organization a deadline that somehow we're tied to, and we don't know that we're tied to it. Can you think of anything? Of course, then that makes the conversation, I don't know, easier or more awkward when somebody senior says, actually, we have promised this for a particular deadline. I think it's a good way of flushing that out. But that, I would say, that's an instance where we didn't have enough knowledge of the organisation. And another one was where, as a result of having a fortnightly risks and issues meeting, there was a question about whether the project was going to be funded, and this required like kind of very high up approval to kind of continue getting funding, and the risk of this kind of went up and up and up and up and up as we got to a particular date, and then it kind of went away completely. And I think a lot of what we would have been seeing from senior stakeholders, the way they were behaving, would have been extremely inexplicable and confusing for us if we hadn't known about essentially there was a funding crisis and a funding battle going on in the background, and that probably also affected what would be priority for the project. So, in a way, this is a very obvious thing that I'm saying, that if you're working in an organization, if you're trying to deliver something in an organization, all of the complexities of the organization potentially have some effect on what you're trying to do. You can't know everything, so you can't do user research with everybody. You have to try and draw some limits around it. You can find out stuff from user research. You can find out stuff from delivering working software and see how people react to it. And you can also find out stuff from talking to senior people and also talking to them about what the risks to the project are. Okay, thanks very much.